Good morning, Austin, and welcome to the Atheist Experience. I'm back after a month's vacation. Jeff B. did a great job while I was gone. I really appreciate that.
Thanks, Ray.
The help there from Vic out there. I'd like to welcome today's guests, Bob Jensen, Rahul, Mahajan. I'm sorry. I get off.
Not bad, not bad.
Okay. Every month, the first Sunday of every month, we do our lecture series, and these gentlemen will be our guest speakers at FERS at North Cross Mall. As soon as we get done here, we're heading right up there. The place opens at 11 a.m. and it's free to the public. I'd like to bring it. Come on out. They'll be discussing U.S. foreign policy, and that's what today's topic's going to be. You can see up there on our telephone number and our topic there. And speaking of lecture series, next month will be Stephen Weinberg, and we're definitely looking forward to having him on there. That's the first Sunday in September. Same thing, FERS North Cross Mall. And then I guess I'll hand it over to Jeff here.
Who is Stephen Weinberg? UT professor of physics?
Correct, thank you.
Audience might not know that.
Okay.
I didn't know that. News, okay. Let's jump right into it. Last week, I did a short news report on the Chinese government crackdown on an organization called Falun Gong, and there's more development than that. Chinese authorities on Thursday ordered the arrest of the leader of the popular Falun Gong meditation group, which the government banned last week as a threat to political and social stability. The order came amid a government campaign to destroy Falun Gong books and materials. State media said Thursday that hundreds of thousands of items had been destroyed. Chinese leaders regard the group, which has up to 70 million members, as the most serious threat to communist rule since pro-democracy protests in 1989. The Ministry of Public Security in Beijing said sect founder Li Hongzhi spread superstition and malicious fallacies to deceive people, resulting in the deaths of many practitioners, the official Xinhua news agency said. The ministry sent a notice to Interpol requesting aid in their investigations and has asked public security departments and border posts to find and arrest Li, the agency said. Li lives in New York. The former Chinese government clerk founded Falun Gong in 1992. He has denied accusations by the government that his group has political ambitions. Chinese authorities said that since last week, they had confiscated or destroyed more than 1.55 million publications of the mystical sect. Falun Gong is one of many schools of Qigong, a practice that tries to improve health through exercise, meditation, and attempts to channel unseen forces. Its doctrines draw on martial arts, Buddhism, and Taoism. Qigong has been popular in China for decades. The crackdown appears to have been prompted by a silent protest on April 25 by more than 10,000 Falun Gong devotees outside the Beijing compound where President Jiang Zemin lives. The group said it was protesting harassment by officials. Reports in state media have blamed Falun Gong for more than 700 deaths, saying followers refused meditation or committed murder or suicide. In Beijing, some 300,000 Falun Gong books were turned into pulp Wednesday, and more were to be destroyed throughout China, state media said. In Shanghai, authorities fed 45,000 books into a pulping machine Thursday at a ceremony led by city propaganda chief Jin Binghua, the newspaper Zenmin Evening News said. State officials and media outlets have kept up a steady stream of attacks on Falun Gong. Falun Gong literature is the enemy of science, civilization, atheism, and dialectical materialism, said Gui Zhaofeng, director of the National Anti-Pornography Office, which removes materials deemed offensive to the Communist Party. On television, former members are shown denouncing Li, and the newspapers quote officials criticizing its doctrines. National TV newscasts have been expanded to a full hour from their usual 30 minutes and are devoted almost completely to attacks on the sect. Communist Party members, thousands of whom openly practiced Falun Gong before the crackdown, have been ordered to quit or be expelled from the party. Now, last week when I commented on the actions of the Chinese Communist government in cracking down on this sect, I made it clear that no atheist I've ever met would support these heavy-handed tactics. You can't force people to be rational. You have to show that it's in their best interest, and not just by telling them that you'll attack them if they don't give in. But lest anyone leap to the conclusion that China's tactics invalidate their claims about the dangers of mysticism, just listen to this. On to our second news story. The Center for Disease Control announces that life expectancy has climbed 30 years since 1900. Americans can expect to live nearly 30 years longer than they did at the turn of the century because of antibiotics, clean drinking water, and advances that have helped control infectious diseases, government researchers say. Since 1900, the overall death rate from diseases like pneumonia and tuberculosis has declined from 797 per 100,000 to 59 per 100,000, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention said Thursday. As a result, life expectancy during that period increased from 47.3 years to 76.1. One of the conclusions that might be that investments made in the tools that are needed to monitor, diagnose, and treat and prevent infectious diseases pay dividends, said Dr. James Hughes, director of the CDC's National Center for Infectious Diseases. The worst U.S. epidemic of an infectious disease was in 1918 when the flu killed 500,000 people. Pneumonia, tuberculosis, and diarrhea enteritis were the three leading causes of death in 1900. Today, the leading causes are heart disease, cancer, and stroke. Early on, improvements in sanitation, hygiene, and living conditions helped control outbreaks of cholera, tuberculosis, and other diseases, the CDC said in the latest of a series of reports on health improvements in the 20th century. Chlorination contributed to the decrease of waterborne diseases, while housing improvements to reduce crowding helped to fight against tuberculosis, which in 1900 killed 194 out of every 100,000 Americans. The improvements have had a profound effect on children under 5, who in 1900 accounted for 30.4% of all deaths. That dropped to just 1.4% in 1997, the CDC said. In the 19-teens, serologic testing became the basic tool to diagnose many diseases like syphilis and gonorrhea. The development of cell cultures in the 1930s paved the way for large-scale production of live or heat-killed viral vaccines. The 1940s ushered in the use of antibiotics like penicillin, which was used to treat sick and wounded U.S. soldiers. And state and local health departments began instituting childhood vaccination programs which helped virtually eliminate often fatal diseases like smallpox and polio. During the later part of the century, advances in molecular biology technology have further improved testing, diagnosing, and monitoring disease, the CDC said. But the success in reducing deaths led to some complacency, they warned. The 1980s saw the emergence of AIDS and other new diseases and the reemergence of tuberculosis and pneumonia. We are increasingly seeing problems with antibiotic resistance to making some of the infections harder to treat, Hughes said, so these microbes that created these illnesses are continuing to evolve. Now, what has all this got to do with China? It's just this. The 30-year increase in average lifespan that we've achieved since 1900 is entirely the result of medical science. No prayers, magic spells, healing amulets, or other mystical healing techniques had anything to do with it. And yet the purveyors of mysticism, in America as well as in China, are cashing in by nurturing paranoia about the supposed inadequacies of a purely rational, scientific approach to healthcare. And to the extent that mysticism undermines the progress of medical science, mysticism is the enemy of civilization. My darling wife, who was on the show last week, did me the favor of finding a web page on Falun Gong, just to give you a taste of what these people actually believe. Here's a snippet. The cultivation energy we refer to appears outside one's body. It grows spiraling from the lower part of the body with the betterment of one's Zinjing. Then it forms an energy pillar on the top of one's head. The whole process takes place outside the body. The height of the energy pillar marks the attainments of one's cultivation energy. The energy pillar exists in a well-concealed space and is difficult for ordinary people to perceive, I'll bet. With the opening of the celestial eye, some people may acquire remote sight, which enables them to see thousands of li, which are Chinese miles, away, and enables them to see this invisible energy that is supposed to indicate your attainment.
Thank you, Arla.
Thanks, Arla. So it's just kooky, and anybody who buys this and doesn't spend their money instead on real medicine is making a terrible mistake. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
You said that quote several times on the show.
And that's the end of the news.
Okay, I've been informed there we're having technical problems. That's the reason the going out with a very blue tint or something. It looks fine here in the studio, but I guess out there in TV land, we're having technical difficulties. Please hang with us. They're working on that as we speak. So if the picture changes, hopefully it'll change for the better. Okay, let me get back to our guests here. I must admit, I'm like probably the average American here. I really don't know much about our American foreign policy. And I talking to you this morning, I realized how ignorant I really am of the foreign policy. So first, why don't you introduce yourselves to the audience here and give us some credentials and how knowledgeable you are on foreign policy. I mean, what?
Well, my name is Bob Jensen. I think the most important credential I would have to talk about this is I'm a U.S. citizen, which means that I have a moral and political responsibility, I think, to inform myself, to understand. My day job is as a professor at the University of Texas in the Department of Journalism, and I'm a former journalist, so I've spent a good part of my life thinking about politics in some fashion.
Along those lines, do you know any other foreign languages? Are you reading other foreign news? Or?
I don't read in other languages, but one of the things about the internet and a large communication sort of revolution is that there's an incredible amount of information available. And one thing you learn, I know this partly from my field, but also from, again, being a citizen trying to inform myself, is that the variety of opinions available in the United States is very truncated. And in fact, it is the foreign press, often available in translation on the net in all sorts of forms, is incredibly important to finding out what is going on in the world, because the American press has a very limited view of that.
Excellent. Rahul?
Yeah, my name is Rahul Mahajan, and I'm a doctoral student in physics here at UT. And for our purposes, I think more importantly, I'm an anti-war activist. For the past couple of years, I've been trying to build some kind of, to help build an anti-war movement here in Austin. We concentrate mainly on working against the sanctions on Iraq, about which I think we'll have a lot more to say later on. And we've also worked a lot against the war in Yugoslavia. And so because of that, I've followed those issues and related ones very closely.
The war in Yugoslavia is quite interesting because, from what I understand, there was an amazing amount of information coming out on the internet on that from people that were actually there live taking, that weren't paid journalists. They were just average people that were actually out there publishing their own stories about that.
Yes, it's quite an amazing occurrence. Perhaps the first time in war where we were getting real-time live reports of what was going on from the victims of aggression, in this case, from the victims of U.S. aggression.
And it helped. I can't help but think back to the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, which made me think of U.S. foreign policy, in which extraordinary claims are made about the role of the United States in the world and the motivations of the United States, most of which are even cursory examination reveals to be fraudulent. Yet these extraordinary claims are made, and in fact in the United States no evidence is required to support them. So when the United States says we're going into Yugoslavia to protect the minority Albanian Kosovars, and that's our goal and that's our mission, even a quick tour through the facts shows that to be false. Yet extraordinary claims like that, which have no basis in history or in contemporary politics, are made without evidence. And I think Rahul is right that the amount of information that was coming out and available to people meant you could challenge those claims now much easier because information was flowing much more easily.
I totally got tight. There was a question there, I totally lost my point there. But we were talking earlier before the show came on, and I brought up the point that several times, especially politicians here in the United States, constantly refer to us as a Christian state. And I was asking what the rest of the world viewed us, and you pointed out that we're viewed as a terrorist, as a thug, and we're just out there doing as what we think's right at the moment, and without much thought. Is that good?
Well, I think there are several terms in what you just said that need to be sort of teased apart.
Sure.
We, who is we? I mean, the United States government often talks about acting on behalf of the American people in the national interest, for instance. Well, whose interests are they really working in, and what policies are they pursuing? We don't have a lot to do with that if we are the American people. As to how we're viewed abroad, I don't think most of, for instance, the Third World is particularly concerned about the religious contours of American society. What they see is the lone remaining superpower that has made it quite clear in the whole post-World War II era, but especially in the last decade, made it quite clear that it will use extraordinary force and violence, really grotesque levels of force and violence to impose its will on the world. So I remember an article from a Chilean newspaper that came out during the 1991 Gulf War, in which the writer ended by saying, let us pray to the various gods around that the United States not come and save us next. Because in the name of saving democracy and freedom around the world, what the United States has done is systematically, annihilated not only large numbers of people, but the possibility of independent development, independent political courses. And I think that's how we're viewed around the world, not as some model of democracy spreading freedom, but as in fact a superpower, a great power that does not shy away from using that level of force and violence.
Well, I think you could make a point for terming the actions of the U.S. in the last decade in the Middle East and in the Balkans a fourth crusade, in a sense. In general, in modern society, the term crusade is used to mean some kind of noble project that one is engaged in. But it's good to remember what the original crusades in the Middle Ages really were, which were the attempt by massive violence, barbaric violence, to spread an ideology by force, that ideology being Christianity, to a people who wanted no part of it. And the Gulf War, the sanctions on Iraq, the war on Yugoslavia are also part and parcel of a new attempt to spread a different kind of ideology. No longer is Christianity the ideology that is necessary to spread or that's particularly profitable to spread, but there are other ideologies that of what I'd like to call free market fundamentalism. Other people call it neoliberalism. Some people use innocuous terms like globalization. But there are a lot of aspects of that ideology which are at the least quasi-religious in nature. You could make a strong case for calling the whole complex of concepts that the U.S. and the First World have been pushing a religious construct.
Interesting. And so I remember the question I was going to say earlier. Sorry about that. I thought it was real interesting that the U.S. news during the Balkans and all that were constantly pointing out who was Christian and who was Muslim, and pointing out the religious, trying to put a religious spin on the war itself. And from what I understand, it really wasn't that much religion involved, really. Maybe no more.
Well, yeah, I think the conflict in the Balkans, although it has religious dimensions, is not rooted in a religious struggle in the sense that in historical context it was. Yeah, this is the whole dismemberment of Yugoslavia, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, and the West's interests in that are, I think, much more complex than can be reduced to religion. Certainly religious tensions, historic religious tensions, have something to do with it. But again, as Rahul points out, the United States doesn't go to war to impose Christianity. The United States goes to war to impose its dominance in the world and to ensure the sort of stability of its transnational corporate system. And
try to use the UN as their authority.
Well, the UN has been at times a vehicle for U.S. power and at times hasn't. In the Gulf War in 1991, the Bush administration decided it could cobble together a UN-backed coalition to go in and destroy Iraqi society. So it did it. In 1998 and 99, when it looked like the UN was going to be less easily used, the United States reactivated NATO, which was a defensive military alliance which had no, its own charter prohibited what happened. The war on Yugoslavia violated law on three different levels. It violated U.S. domestic law, it violated international law, and it violated the NATO charter itself. The United States uses various regional and international agencies to the degree it finds it useful.
So, depending on what the case is.
Yeah,
right.
I mean, it's looking to bury the UN right now, apparently.
As Madeleine Albright said not long ago, we will act multilaterally when we can and unilaterally when we must, which basically means we'll act as we see fit and we don't really care who else agrees with us.
That's interesting. We do have a caller here, so let's see if we've got all the phones worked out right here and stuff. Dennis?
Yeah.
Good morning.
Good morning to you all. I kind of just tuned in here a few minutes ago, but I've had a minute or so to catch up with your discussion. First of all, let me say I am a Persian Gulf veteran, so I was there. I was on the ground.
Interesting.
I'd like to say, first of all, that Rahul has spoke a little bit about being anti-war, but I have to tell you, Rahul, it sounds to me primarily anti-American policy, because my interpretation of what I hear you saying is that it's American war that you have a problem with. I just can't think of any major power in the world that doesn't use war to assert themselves wherever they feel necessary for whatever their personal agenda is. Would anybody like to speak to that?
Why don't you give him a chance to answer that? I think that's excellent.
Well, and there's several things I can do. First of all, I can think of many countries in the world which don't use war. I can think of no countries in the world which use war as often and as destructively as the United States. And last, as a citizen of the United States, as somebody who's living here, my responsibility in opposing oppression starts at home.
Excellent point. Yes, thank you. Color?
Well, there's lots of forms of oppression. Frankly, I think that religion is frequently just used as a front. I mean, truthfully, war is about money, real estate, power, possession, and manipulation of workforces. Religion has, it's just a way to rally the fever, I suppose. At any rate, I'm also curious about your other guest there. I'm sorry, I don't know your name, sir.
Bob.
Bob, are you a veteran?
No, I'm not.
Are any of you fellows veterans?
No, in fact, I'm not a veteran, partly.
Jeff? I didn't think
No,
you were.
no.
Okay. None of us are.
So really none of
Haven't
you
spoken
have
up.
a war experience.
No, and I, wouldn't apologize for not being a veteran. I think one has to, when one criticizes U.S. policy, one has to make a distinction between the people who have control over policy and critiques of their motivations and their judgment, and separate that from the people who actually execute the policy, that is, the people who fight.
So, sir, do you feel like you've separated yourself from the policymakers of this country by...
No, I feel as a citizen of the United States who has certain moral and political responsibilities that in a democracy, or at least a nominal democracy in which a certain amount of freedom of thought and expression is still allowed, that part of my job is to highlight what I believe are unjust decisions by my government.
I agree completely.
And I think one separates then that critique from critique of people who might find themselves in the military. For instance, my little brother, who was a U.S. Marine, was out by the time of the Gulf War, but was subject to being reactivated. And I certainly could have distinguished between what he would have done or felt he had to do versus what George Bush felt he had to do. I assess people's sort of moral accountability partly based on the options they have and the power they have. So my focus, as Rahul sort of alluded to, as a citizen of a country in which its government pursues policies that have such incredibly destructive consequences, I think that is the job of citizens, to make their voices heard. So, I have respect for and have had, productive discussions with people both in the military and former military people. But I think, again, my moral obligation is to resist the government.
That's a great point. I'm glad you said it exactly that way, to resist the government that you don't agree with.
Right.
Do you pay taxes?
I do. There are a number of people who have made a principled choice to withhold all or part of their taxes, as they're called war tax resistors. That's a strategy, as is the case with every political strategy. One assesses the pros and cons of it. Of course, if you become a war tax resistor, it means essentially you can't own property. If you can't own property, that means certain other things are cut off.
Oh, it's without a doubt, it's a challenge.
Yeah.
But I tell you, I have a huge amount of respect for any man who will take a stand and stick with it and defend it wholeheartedly. But I have a problem though if you have such a heartfelt conviction. how can you possibly face yourself every morning in the mirror and know that you're still a taxpayer?
No,
That you're still supporting a government in, you know,
yeah,
that
again,
you don't believe in.
I see that as a strategic question. You know, the world forces me to do all sorts of things I don't particularly like. I mean, for instance, I'm a professor at the University of Texas, and I feel the system by which I give grades and assess students is really quite horrific and it impedes education. Yet I do it because if I don't, I'll get fired and I can't do the job I want to do. So I think these are not necessarily principled questions. They're strategic questions. To do anti-war activism, one possible route is to become a war tax resistor. And in fact, in Austin, there's a small community of people who've done that. And I think both symbolically and practically it has great value. There are other avenues for political work. And being a war tax resistor cuts off some of those. So these are choices which there's no obvious and easy answer. And I think all of our choices should constantly be subject to this kind of scrutiny you're offering. I don't have a problem with it.
No, everybody has to do what they in their heart feel.
I just want a clarification. The caller is talking about paying taxes to a government that you don't believe in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, is it the current policy of the current administration that is the issue with you, or is it our democratic system of government?
Oh, boy.
Because I would draw a distinction there, right?
Well, yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, I tell you, I mean, frankly, I see no difference between Democrats and Republicans. Absolutely none.
No, but I'm not talking about
Oh, I
about
thought you
that.
asked
I'm
me
talking
about the
just
current
the idea
administration.
that we elect people to represent us and they make the decisions. I mean, if you support the idea of the type of government that we have, I could see the sense in continuing to pay taxes because you're supporting the continuation of that system, even if the people in power are doing things that you don't support.
Well, I believe in a democratic republic, and I believe that we once had one. I also believe that by virtue of belonging to the UN and selling our rights to the International Monetary Fund, that we have sold the birthright of most Americans a long time ago, and I don't know. Frankly, I'm very confused a lot of times about what exactly I have left, you know, in regards to my citizenship and the country that I thought that I lived in, the country that I loved. The older I get and the more informed I become, seems to be less than what I originally thought I had. So there's a lot of difficulty here, but I'm struggling with it. I'm seeking more information. I'm intrigued by shows like you guys do. I watch you frequently, as a matter of fact. I think you're, although I don't necessarily agree with everything that I hear, I definitely think that it's appropriate for you guys to be there and to be saying what you're saying. I just think that there's not only my confusion, but I think there's some confusion on the part of you and your guest at times in what exactly the relationship between politics and religion, and in this case foreign policy, is. I'd like to clear up one last thing, and then I think I probably ought to go and let someone else have a chance here. But I'd just like to say one last thing.
Sure.
As a veteran of the ground forces in the Persian Gulf, and having networked with a number of veterans and veterans groups since then, what I believe has really happened in that experience, and you're welcome to research this and make your own decision, but what most of us have concluded is that, of course, this thing was just a put-up deal right from the start. With a nod and a wink, we encouraged Saddam to have his way with the smallest shore country, port country that he could get away with, when in fact what we really wanted was an opportunity to put into physical test something that had only been on paper for a full generation, the all-volunteer force, to use the active military as what they even referred to back then as speed bumps, and then mobilize the citizen forces, and just to see if it would work, and to do it in a situation where they could control it the easiest with the least amount of collateral damage. I mean, what better playground, a big sandbox. So it's cost an awful lot, not only monetarily, but there are huge numbers of very sick veterans out there in relation to, in regards to the inoculations and various pills and such that were given to us, and God only knows what all was involved. So, I guess all I want to say is I encourage any anti-war sentiment. No one is more anti-war than someone who's perhaps lived through it. I encourage that, but fellas, you got to get a grip, man. It's not just us. There is no country in the world, no society in the world that will not use war to get what they want any way that they need to.
And I think it's important to acknowledge that, in fact, throughout history, the great powers have used not only warfare, but incredibly brutal levels of warfare to achieve essentially economic goals. I don't disagree. I think we're
That's all it's
in
about.
agree, yeah. But again, as the dominant power in the world at the moment, the United States is the threat to world peace that must be attended to. And as citizens of the United States, it's a reasonable, I think, assertion.
You don't see North Korea or China.
Half of North Korea is on the verge of starvation. I think you have to understand that the United States...
starvation will encourage warfare.
The United States, the main problem after the fall of the Berlin Wall for United States foreign policy was you didn't have a ready-made enemy. And in fact, the last decade you can see in U.S. foreign policy as sort of a search for enemies. Is it Colombian narco-traffickers? Is it Middle East terrorists? Is it North Koreans who might have a missile someday that could make it to Japan? I mean, to present North Korea as a threat that requires a $300 billion a year military budget is laughable. But I want to go back to the Gulf War and agree with you on a couple of points and expand on a couple. One is the United States treatment of veterans reveals, I think, the character of the government that we live with. Just as the effects of Agent Orange in Vietnam were, routinely ignored and the health of veterans was ignored, we're going to see the same thing out of the Gulf War and Yugoslavia with depleted uranium weapons, other health threats that the United States is already trying to bury. That tells you something about how the United States government is concerned with ordinary people, whether they are Iraqis or Serbians or Americans, in fact. The other thing I think we can learn from the Gulf War is I agree with you that it was, to some degree, a setup, and in fact in Bob Woodward's recent book, he confirms through some anonymous sources what we pretty much knew to be true, which is the Bush administration's main fear during the negotiations that led up to the Gulf War, that war would be averted. In fact, the Bush administration sought a war, and it wanted war in the Middle East. It blocked meaningful negotiations during the Kuwaiti-Iraqi crisis, primarily because it wanted to not just, I think, test the all-volunteer army, but to test a large number of new weapons and to make clear to the world what exactly the contours of power after the fall of the Berlin Wall were.
I agree.
And I think it can be reduced to George Bush's pithy little statement during the war, which is what we say goes. That's, if you want to understand the Gulf War, that was it. It was an imposition on the world of American force, especially in the most resource-rich region of the world.
I agree 100%.
Well,
I agree completely with that statement.
There's several things I'd like to say also in response to a number of things that you've said, Dennis. One of them being that I find it interesting that when you talk about the massive scale of destruction of the Gulf War, you're talking about the effect on the veterans. Now, it's true that hundreds of thousands of veterans have suffered from Gulf War syndrome to greater or lesser degrees. 142 people, soldiers in the U.S. forces were killed during the Gulf War. But counterpose that to hundreds of thousands of Iraqis killed. In the Amaria bomb shelter alone, perhaps 1,000 women and children were vaporized. So many of them that it's impossible even to count the number of bodies in that shelter because most of them were just turned into gas.
You know what? I'm sorry. I really have a real problem developing any sympathy for someone that was trying to kill me.
Okay, how is a child in a bomb shelter trying to kill you?
You know what? You can bait me with that till the cows come home, and I'm not going for it, Bub. I've been in these conversations before.
Well,
let me tell you something. First of all, I personally cannot take any responsibility for some bomb shelter that women and children were killed in Iraq any more than my father's generation or any of your father's generation could take responsibility for a bomb shelter in London. Okay, do you see my point here?
If
Civilians are always the most abhorrent casualties in any war. So for you to point out some specific bomb shelter in Iraq or someplace else is not going to work with me, buddy.
Well, I'm not trying.
Here's the way it goes.
I'm not trying
Warfare
to work on
is bad for children and other living things. You remember that poster? You remember that? I mean, this is not anything
Yes,
new.
why is it that you don't care about that?
Forever,
That's what I'm
since
trying
the
to
Roman
ask you.
legions.
Yeah.
It's always been bad for civilians.
Yeah, but you don't seem to care, and unfortunately.
Oh, I do care. I do care a great deal. I care enough to be in this discussion. I care about war because I myself may be going to the next one. And if not me, perhaps the sons and daughters of my brothers. I have a problem with this. I'm telling you that you guys are missing the point. The war is not, wars are not determined by you and I and voters or even the little puppet politicians in Washington. Now, what I do think is that guys like George Bush, who have special connections to greater powers, Skull and Bone Society and various other people and organizations that I'm only now learning about, and I really can't discuss in depth because I don't know enough about it. But I know that there are power brokers and manipulators in this world that push and pull people like you and me around and keep us at each other, so that we don't discover who's really behind the curtain manipulating things, really.
Well, I do appreciate you calling in, but we have a bunch
Sure.
of other callers online.
I understand that, and thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you. You have a great week. And,
I think there was a misunderstanding in that last exchange. Rahul, I don't think, was suggesting that the caller had some personal culpability for that bomb shelter attack, right? He seemed to be reacting as if you were saying it was his fault or he should have done something or something like that.
What I was talking about is the fact that in the media and to a large extent in the American consciousness, casualties of foreigners, especially of third world foreigners, are invisible.
Yeah.
People, when you say the number of people killed in the Gulf War, you mean 142. You don't even mean 338, which is the number killed in all the Allied forces, let alone hundreds of thousands of Iraqis.
yeah, we're not even counting our own allies.
I think there are a couple of points to sort of wind up that call and move into the next one.
Sure.
One is I don't think I fundamentally disagree with the caller that it is institutional, structural factors in American politics, foreign policy, and the economy that really drive the kind of problems we're seeing, and that it has to be resisted at that level. But I also think Rahul makes an important point. If you look at, for instance, the consciousness of the American public in regards to the Vietnam War, there's a Vietnam memorial in Washington for the roughly 60,000 American soldiers that died. There is no memorial in this country to the 3 to 4 million Southeast Asians who died as a direct result of the United States attack on Vietnam and Laos and Cambodia. That is, we're morally responsible as a nation, a kind of collective political responsibility for 3 to 4 million deaths of people who would not have died if not for the United States policy. Yet we remember and mourn for, as we should mourn for, the 60,000 American soldiers, but what about those other people? And I think what Rahul is referring to is this sort of obsessive focus on the price that Americans pay when we go to war, when in fact the price that is paid is really paid by the people in the countries where we're invading. And that's the kind of consciousness I think we have to develop precisely to allow people to see the way the structure works and resist the structure. It's not a problem of George Bush. It's not a problem of Bill Clinton. They're, essentially just holding places and keeping seats warm for a system that goes on and on because there's a certain logic to the system that will keep engaging in this kind of, really brutal warfare to achieve goals.
And one last thing before we get to the next caller, which is I think it's interesting that this guy, who's coming from a very different political perspective, who by a few comments he made obviously showed that he's an extreme right-winger, talking about the democratic republic we used to have back in the days when we still had slaves, when women couldn't vote, that kind of democratic republic. It shows that how thin the structures of rationalization and the kinds of arguments that the government and media are giving for why the U.S. does these things are wearing, that people like that people who are not actuated by any of the kinds of concerns that traditional anti-war people are actuated by are beginning to see that it's not about humanitarianism, it's not the will of the American people, there are other forces involved. They often misidentify those other forces. They tend to think in terms of conspiracy theories instead of structures of interests and of larger blocks of forces that do determine things. But it's interesting that it shows how thin the established ideology is wearing at times.
Excellent point. Okay, next on the line is Joe Zamecki. He is a member of our group, and I guess he could be our New Jersey correspondent. Joe?
Well, good morning.
Good morning, Joe.
How y'all doing?
Excellent.
Got a full slate today, I hear.
Yes, doing real well.
All right. I'm glad to have you back, Ray.
Thank you.
Yeah. Just want to tell y'all real
How
quick.
come you didn't call on my watch, Joe?
I'm sorry. I tried. Actually, I was so busy these last few weeks, so I've been working weekends and didn't get to.
Okay.
But I'm going to try to get back on track with that. But did want to brag about last night. Something took place over here in New Jersey. There were 2 parties in one day of free thinkers. The North Jersey Humanists put on a nice little party, their annual picnic, and then I went to that. And then we went to New Jersey Humanist Network party, and it was great out in the country, and they had a good turnout, about 45 people. And just wanted to brag about that. 2 of those in one day, and things over here are starting to take off. I'm starting a little local group over here called Union County, New Jersey Atheists. Already got a website, and going to a meeting here in about 20 minutes as soon as I get off the phone. And
Tell them we all said hi and wish you luck on the new group.
Great, yeah, I'll do that. Okay. And of course, I'm selling the Atheist Community of Austin. Real successful group y'all have there, and so I'm telling people all about how easy it can be to make a group like that, really successful, with some friends and some help and some little bit of effort. And y'all are about 3 years old now, right?
Yeah. Well, we're over 3 years old.
Still an hour-and-a-half TV show, though. I think y'all should bring that up to 3 hours at least. So,
we'll have to do some checking on that, huh?
Right. I'm trying to start a show over here, too. And, the public access stations over here are very busy, and it's hard to get in a slot. So that may take a while, though. But I'm determined. Anyway, that was it, and if you want to put me on hold, I'd love to listen for a while.
Sure thing.
All right, thanks a lot.
You have a great week.
Yep, see you later.
Joe was a former co-host. His job took him to New Jersey, and that's how Jeff B. ended up with the slot he has. And he's done an excellent job.
That's right.
So we'll just keep right on going with callers. You enjoying the callers here?
Good.
And Mary?
Good morning.
Good morning. Mary's a regular caller.
It's good to see you back, Mr. Blevins.
Thank you, Mary.
Although Jeff did a really good job while you were gone.
Yes, I got to see a couple of the shows.
Thank you very much.
I saw as many as I could. I missed a few because you know how I am. But anyway, I'm glad to see Professor Jensen on your show.
You know him?
I know his work.
Well, excellent.
And are you going to tape his talk today?
I got my camera. I was debating on that. Are you wanting a copy?
Yes, I would.
Well, call our voicemail. We'll see what we can work out. I don't know, and we'll have to get Bob's approval too.
I sure
we'll
would.
see what we can do about that, Mary.
I sure would appreciate that. What I wasn't going to call this morning. I was just going to let it flow. But that military caller a minute ago just made me call, shall we say. I grew up in San Antonio, and there's a lot of military down there, and I really don't respect the military on any level. And it brings me to the point where I don't like the way they treat women. That's the bottom line. I can't respect what they're doing. I can't call them the good guys because I don't like the way they treat people. And for him to so cavalierly deny responsibility for the civilian lives, what is the war about if it's not defending the civilians? I mean, how can he be so flip about killing children in bomb shelters? And when I don't remember the young man's name, tried to ask him, how is that child trying to kill you? They just won't even deal with it. They don't even talk about it because it threatens their own self-image. And that's enough of that. I can really get off on that. What I saw Alan Pogue. The reason I'm this way, and I'm shaking right now, okay? The reason I saw Alan Pogue's show last night about midnight, he brought back pictures of the civilian damage.
I don't know who that is.
Alan Pogue's a local photographer who's traveled widely and documented the effects of war and the sanctions.
Oh, okay.
And it's making me crazy.
Well, I think the points are important. To see the military as a system of authority, and it imposes that authority in all sorts of unpleasant ways, including on women within its own rank. The military is not set up for justice, peace, and democracy. It's set up to,
It's worse on civilian women.
Right.
What they do to the towns where those bases are is corrupt them to the bottom, to the pit of whatever.
And again, the point she makes, when the U.S. military goes and sets up bases in foreign countries, they often cut deals with local people to provide prostitutes for the service people. I mean, the system is corrupt to the core for obvious reasons. I think a couple of points, though. One has to continue to make distinctions between individual people, especially, for instance, people out of poor and working class communities who see the military as a vehicle for some sort of upward mobility. One has to distinguish between the choices people at that level make and the systematic nature, the sort of horrific systematic nature of the U.S. military's effects on not only the world, but on, it's being pointed out here as well. The other thing I'd like to point out about Alan Pogue, for instance, again, a local Austin photographer who's dedicated a lot of his life to documenting these problems. Alan Pogue is himself a veteran. And one of the things that is quite clear from post-World War II U.S. military intervention is that a lot of the soldiers who go abroad come back with a new consciousness, certainly out of Vietnam, the Veterans for Peace, Vietnam Veterans Against the War. It's in fact a kind of up-close and personal view that the first caller was referring to, that people on the front line get, that can sometimes change minds and change hearts. Alan Pogue is a great example of someone who served in Vietnam and came back and has dedicated his life to peace, not to war.
Right? And he's doing wonderful work.
Yes, he is.
I think my ultimate point is that we've got a new millennium supposedly coming up. The future is going to change, and we have got to radically question all of these institutions, every one of them, down to the very, very bottom. And if we've got the imagination and the heart to do it, we've got to refashion society in a more compassionate way.
Yes, we
That's
do.
all. Thank you.
Have a great week, Mary.
And I think it's important to add that although we focus usually when we talk about institutional responsibilities, about how the government, about how corporations, about how institutions with power are responsible for things like war, for things like the sanctions on Iraq, it's still important to note that individuals are responsible insofar as they participate in structures of illegitimate authority. That includes the military, and that also includes most of the rest of us.
Yeah. And to go back to another thought I had earlier,
Sure.
the way out of that, I think, the way in which you can see your responsibility and see an individual connection to these systems is through collective action. Rahul and I have been involved in a couple of different groups locally for the past couple of years. And it's important, people out in the audience might be listening and feeling rather disconnected and fragmented. The nature of American society is such that political work, being politicized, talking politics, is often seen as impolite or somehow un-American. And in fact, one of the important things, I think, to highlight about the anti-war movement, as well as other, I think, critical and radical political movements, is they provide a space where people can come together and talk and discuss and figure out what that collective responsibility is. It's very hard when you're sitting alone in front of the tube, all night, to figure out what you think, let alone what you should do about it. And I think that one of the messages I like to spread as often as possible is one has to get involved in collective action, whether it's through peace work or environmental work or feminist work, whatever it is. There are places where people with common philosophies, common commitments to the kind of society that Mary was talking about come together, and that's the kind of work. I know my own sort of views, the depth of understanding has increased incredibly in the last couple of years, partly by engaging in the kind of work that Rahul and I have been doing, along with all sorts of other people.
I think the mention of Alan Poe brings us to another topic that I'd like to talk about, which is that the chief atrocity right now being committed by this nation, by the nation that we live in the world, which is the sanctions on Iraq. On August 6, 1990, shortly after Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the UN imposed an economic blockade on Iraq, which has not been lifted to this date. We're coming close to the 9th anniversary. What it meant was that initially no country could buy anything from Iraq or sell anything to Iraq except for a few strictly humanitarian items like medicine. However, it was essentially, that was a pointless exemption because Iraq was not making any money to buy any of those things. The situation is slightly better now. Under the oil for food deal, Iraq manages to get several $1 billion a year worth of oil sales, which is not anywhere near enough to buy what it needs. The sanctions are an extremely harsh and repressive regime being placed on Iraq. U.S. officials have called it the most comprehensive regime of sanctions ever placed on any nation in modern history. And what it has led to is the death of over 1 million innocent civilians, more than half of them children under the age of 5 years old. People who are not trying to kill anyone, people who are just desperately trying to live. Perhaps 5 times as many people have been killed by the sanctions as were killed by the Gulf War originally. And this is a crime. This is a crime that targets the children, elderly, and the weak in general. This is a crime that is being levied primarily by the United States, and for the stated purpose of getting Saddam Hussein to dismantle his so-called weapons of mass destruction. The U.S., of course, is the nation in the world with by far the largest arsenal of weapons of mass destruction and the most demonstrated willingness to use them. But independent of that, it's very clear right now that Iraq is, even among the countries in the region, it is the weakest. It's been starved. It's been destroyed. Most of its weapons have been destroyed. It is no longer a threat to any of its neighbors. Furthermore, the sanctions are strengthening Saddam Hussein by starving the populace, making sure that they cannot possibly rise up, which is one of the stated goals of the sanctions, to get the populace to rise up against Saddam Hussein. In fact, what they're doing is strengthening Saddam Hussein's hold on power and starving the rest of society, starving innocent people. I don't think it's too much to call this a genocide that's being committed in our name, and it's going on every day. 1 million people or more already dead. 6,000 children every month. 6,000 children under the age of 5 are dying because of the sanctions. And so far, there has been some work done. There's been some efforts to protest the sanctions, but not nearly enough. This is a responsibility we all have, just like the responsibility that the Germans had during the Holocaust that they shirked. And we're shirking it right now, many of us.
I think that the points Rahul makes are incredibly important because there's no shooting war going on, although that's not technically true. The United States is bombing Iraq on an almost daily basis in the no-fly zones in the north, in which the United States has unilaterally imposed these no-fly zones. They have no standing in international law.
Not to interrupt you, but that's news to me. I was under the impression we're just patrolling. Yeah. We're actually bombing that area?
Yeah. This is actually a very, I think, illustrative story, and let's just talk about it a bit.
Please.
After the 1991 Gulf War, the French, the British, and the United States instituted no-fly zones in the north and in the south. The stated reason was to protect the Shiites in the south and the Kurds in the north. This was, of course, the common pretext the United States would use. It's important to note those were never UN-instituted no-fly zones. Those were imposed by the French, the British, and the United States. The French have since pulled out. They've changed policy a bit in Iraq. So what you have now is the United States and Britain unilaterally imposing on a sovereign nation rules about its own airspace. Okay? This is a violation of international law. The United States and Britain have no right under international law to do this. What happens is when Iraqi radar stations illuminate or light up or lock on to American or British planes, the United States has said this is justification for the United States to launch attacks. Now these attacks may or may not be on defense sites. They bomb communications sites. Basically, the United States has bombed at will. Civilians have died in fairly large numbers during these. There have been more than 60 of these attacks since December, since the end of the Desert Fox campaign. Another illegal U.S. bombing of Iraq. The number of illegal U.S. actions in Iraq after the Gulf War just seemed to multiply. So we actually have a shooting war going on in Iraq in which the United States is violating international law. Now, the first caller, I want to tie this in, said, part of the problem is that the United States has surrendered its sovereignty to the UN. That's a joke. The United States uses the UN the way it wants to. The United States has never surrendered any of its sovereignty to the UN. In fact, it uses UN when it's convenient. It ignores it when it's not convenient, and we see that in these no-fly zones now. But at the same time, the American public will sometimes pay attention to hot wars, to bombing. This ongoing war through the sanctions that Rahul summarized is the most important humanitarian crisis in the world at the moment. And it's a crisis that the United States is not trying to stop. In fact, the United States is responsible for the crisis. So the sanctions are not the absence of warfare. They're a different kind of warfare. Basically, if you take the destruction of the Iraqi infrastructure during the 1991 Gulf War, plus the effects of the sanctions, we have devastated a society, taken a fairly industrialized society, and taken it back to very sort of almost Stone Age levels. And there are both immediate and long-term consequences to this, to the Iraqi people. As Rahul said, the UN studies suggest that more than 1 million people have died as a direct result of these sanctions. And the rebuilding of Iraqi society that's going to have to go forward after the sanctions is going to take decades. And children and the most vulnerable, the weak, the aged, the sick, are going to continue to die in large numbers. And if you ask why would the United States do this, as people often say, I have no stake in destroying Iraqi society, they will say, why is this happening? I think we go back to George Bush's pithy little aphorism, what we say goes. This is an attempt by the United States to show that if you resist the imposition of American power around the world, this is what will happen. We will destroy your society, and we don't care. We don't care how many civilians die. We don't care what happens. And I think that Rahul quite correctly points out this is a pressing, compelling moral problem that the United States must address. And since the United States government is the source of the problem, it's up to the American people to address it.
It'll be interesting to see how much coverage that gets on the next presidential election coming up. My gut feeling is going to be very little coverage.
It has gotten very little coverage so far in any mainstream arenas.
Exactly.
It's only in the past year or so that there have even been articles in newspapers about the effects of the sanctions. And there have been a few, thanks essentially to the sterling efforts of many anti-sanctions activists in the United States. If it wasn't for them, if it wasn't for people like Kathy Kelly and Voices in the Wilderness who go to Iraq in violation of the sanctions to bring medicine to the people, and if it weren't for their efforts to publicize this, there's no way that this would have been covered, and there's certainly no way that U.S. politicians would ever have felt the need to say very much about this. I think that it's important to talk a little bit about why things like this happen, and I think it ties in actually with the normal subject of this show. For a long time now, and very, very explicitly since the Second World War, the United States has been trying to impose a certain ideology on the rest of the world, the ideology of the free market. It's doing this not because of some mystical belief that the free market is good or that the free market is extremely conducive to human rights. It's doing this because as a rich and powerful nation, as a nation capable of outproducing the rest of the world at the time of the Second World War, it was to its advantage to do this, to force markets abroad open. This meant more jobs, more profits for American companies, the strengthening of the American elite, in a sense, with regard to the rest of the world. Now, the ideology of the free market is contrary to what you might think is not a natural one. It's something that often required direct, brutal force to impose on other people. So, in order to impose this ideology, which essentially means to impose a regime in which the resources of other countries get to be utilized by the United States instead of by the people of those countries, require that the U.S. build itself up as a military presence and as one that could use force sometimes, but also the threat of force and coercion, because there was no way that the United States could take on all of the world at the same time militarily, so it had to make object lessons of the countries that resisted the most. Vietnam was an object lesson. Yes, in the beginning, the U.S. intervened partly because of economic interests in Vietnam, but obviously the costs of the war itself were far greater. There was much more at stake than simply the specific economic interest in Vietnam. It was an object lesson. It showed the rest of the world what the United States was willing to do in order to keep on with its program of forcing an ideology down other people's throats and enforcing a regime of oppression down other people's throats. That was, to some extent, a failure. Vietnam managed to resist, and the U.S. had to retrench that policy for a long time. But ever since Reagan came into power, it's been slowly building up again, and Iraq was the first major example, the first major object lesson in this new world order. And it's important to keep that in mind. Yes, there are economic interests involved in Iraq. There were interests of oil companies. There certainly was no interest in Iraq's taking over and being able to use Kuwait's oil, because Iraq is one of the countries where the oil resources are used more for the people and less for the benefit of multinational corporations and less for investment in other Western companies. But primarily, Iraq is an object lesson, and that's what the sanctions are, pure and simple. If you don't abide by what the U.S. wants, if you don't participate in this new world order, your people will be starved into submission. And it's happening in more subtle ways all around the world. It's not just Iraq. Iraq is the most extreme and egregious case because they're directly not being allowed to sell their own oil to buy food and medicine for their population. But it's going around in the rest of the world in many similar ways.
From what I understand, we're also doing it monetary too. We're refusing the international loans and everything else unless they reorganize their banking system and everything else.
Absolutely.
To accommodate us.
That's
so
correct.
we're willing to use whatever means necessary, basically, is what it sounds like.
Essentially, yes. Economic means and military means both. They're both important prongs of this, and they're both necessary. And the object lessons that the U.S. has used have generally been forceful enough that now it gets to use more economic means and less military means. It's becoming harder and harder for other people to resist the U.S., even though the scale of oppression is growing all the time. To take just one example, you know that in the last few years, recent breakthroughs in treating AIDS have been immense, and now AIDS can actually be treated with drugs. The usual course of treatment costs about $20,000 a year, which is far more than people in, say, Africa can afford, and Africa is ravaged by AIDS. So there are African countries that want African companies to produce AIDS drugs at an affordable price for the people. There are United States politicians who are directly serving the interests of pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer that want to prevent this, Al Gore being a primary example. This is the kind of thing that the United States does. This is, in a way, just as egregious an act as the sanctions on Iraq, and it's going to kill a lot of people. And there's many other examples we can give. The death toll from these things, even though they don't seem very dramatic, even if they don't involve huge bunker buster bombs, is staggering. It's in the millions, in the tens of millions every year. And the U.S. is a large part of this.
Just to remind everyone, we are live August 1st, and Bob and Rahul with an H there, are going to be at North Cross Mall, so you can come out and meet them in person, and we'll be going into more detail at the lecture there. And we will take your phone calls live on the air. This is August 1st. Just to remind everyone.
Well, let me ask you a question. The idea that is used to support the United States goal of opening up markets in other countries is that if those other countries are brought into the free market system, that will be good for the people that live there, right? I mean, we use that to justify our actions. Now, you seem to be saying that what it's really all about is the United States going in and pilfering their resources. Why is it that this doesn't help the people there? I mean, why does that not work?
I have some answers, but we'll let Jeff answer.
Well, again, I think you have to distinguish between who you mean by the people. Okay, so if you take a country like Mexico or Indonesia, free market or free market ideology has benefited some of the people in those. It's benefited a small strata of the elite who are in various kinds of alliances with first world banks and investment houses. But ask yourself how much the average working person in Indonesia, at a Nike factory is benefited by this, right? The fact is, Rahul made this point, and it's an important one, that many of the people in various regions of the world have had to be driven by force into this international market system. There's a resistance to it, and the resistance has largely been broken over the past 20, 30 years by force and violence and coercion of various kinds. Free market ideology doesn't benefit the people, if by the people you mean the mass of people living inside.
Right. Which is the implication of the
but it's not
claim
designed
that's used
to.
justify.
Right. That's like saying, how has free market ideology benefited the working people of the United States? Well, it's raised standards of living in some cases, but if you want to talk about building a just and equitable society in which people have access to the resources they need, right, there are many other models of development beyond the free market ideology that have potential. The question is, why aren't those models being tried? And the answer is, to a large degree, those models have been destroyed by American violence. If you look at the main American interventions in the post-World War II period, in the Middle East, in Central and Latin America, in Southeast Asia, to a large degree, as Rahul pointed out, those were meant to destroy independent development models, right? These were not all societies that were going to be directly yoked to the Soviet Union. That wasn't the point. The point was they were offering a different model. That's why the sort of irrational obsession with Cuba continues today. As people still talk about the threat of Cuba to the United States, which is a joke, right? The threat of Cuba was then and is now and always has been the possibility that it would offer a different model of development. It was in fact a virus, and the talk about the domino theory and the virus effect of countries like Vietnam was real in the sense that American policymakers thought not that it would spread communism in some quest for world domination, but that it would spread the notion that the people of a region had a right to control the resources of their region, which is against U.S. interests. The U.S. belief is that, for instance, in the Middle East, oil is a resource that, while it might in some nominal sense belong to the people who live on it, it is to be controlled. The profits from it are to be controlled by the West. Right? That's the principle at stake. And all of these interventions, the use of military force to back up economic policy, have been to ensure that. I might quibble a bit with Rahul about, although it's just a semantic thing to some sense, we won the Vietnam War in a very real sense. What we did was destroy that possibility of independent development. And in a sense, we inoculated the rest of Southeast Asia. The big prize in Southeast Asia was not Vietnam, it was Indonesia. And when Suharto took over in '65 and a brutal military regime was instituted in Indonesia that would be sympathetic to and in fact very much in bed with Western corporations, that was the big prize in Southeast Asia, and we won. And after 1965, the Vietnam War was largely irrelevant for American policymakers had been smarter, they would have realized this, because the prize was already secured. Right? So in a very real way, we won the Vietnam War, even though in military terms it was a terrible defeat. But politically and economically, its goals were to a large degree achieved. And that process has continued on. And in Nicaragua, in Cuba, all through Latin America. The willingness of the United States to support both indigenous forces that were incredibly brutal, the death squads, the military governments, is another indication of the lengths to which the United States will go to impose this free market ideology, which does not benefit the people. Go ask, the peasant communities of Guatemala and Nicaragua how much they've benefited from free market ideology, and you'll get a very different story.
I don't want to get into quibbling with Bob, but I'd like to get back to the question you asked. I think there's a few more things to be said. One very obvious answer to make to a question like that is that whether the people are going to be benefited or not, shouldn't they be allowed to make those decisions? Mm-hmm. And in fact, the U.S. has never, ever allowed the people of a country to make those decisions. It's employed coercion, it's employed economic tactics, it's employed military force, it's employed just about whatever seemed doable at the time in order to influence those decisions. Another point is, what is the free market? What is the essence of the free market ideology? One of the things that the whole free market ideology is about is measuring the importance of the worth of people by how much they consume. People who don't have enough money to consume more than the basic necessities count less than people who can consume more. Tuberculosis drugs are of use to the poorest people because they're the ones who get tuberculosis. But those people don't count because they don't have enough money to interest the drug companies. So lots of companies have discontinued making tuberculosis drugs, and deaths from tuberculosis have skyrocketed. In fact, not long ago, several years ago, there was a huge increase in deaths from tuberculosis in American cities, and it took 1.5 years for American companies to start making streptomycin again to treat it. That's the kind of thing that the free market leads to. The most egregious atrocities going on in the world today are a direct result of the free market and the kinds of valuations it places on human life. And this and drugs and pharmaceuticals and the international campaign to force the third world people not to be able to afford basic drugs is a primary example of that.
And the free market, of course, is also an ideological construct, since large corporations, transnational corporations, aren't interested in truly free markets. They're interested in radical state intervention to support their own power. So, I mean, the most obvious example was an SNL, savings and loan industry, that was all for deregulation when it looked like that would, increase their profits. When it turned out that deregulation led to, a collapse of the industry. Government bailouts were seen as a perfectly appropriate strategy for saving investors. Okay? This is what free market means. It means state support for the most powerful entities in society, both domestic and abroad, and nothing like, it's like free trade. The free trade, there's nothing free about trade. Free trade is another ideological construct in which powerful, mainly transnational corporations, use it to open up the economies. So the NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement, had nothing to do with free trade. It had to do with opening up the Mexican economy to American-based corporations for penetrating it and taking over those resources.
To put it very simply, the free market means freedom for the powerful and a almost complete lack of freedom for the powerless, which happen to be the majority of people in the world.
Okay, and I'm not trying to be critical, but I want to understand, because I haven't really thought much about this. I mean, it's undeniable that in the United States we have an incredibly high standard of living, and we have this. I mean, the free market ideology is theoretically what we're using here. Now, why is it that we have this high standard of living, but when the ideology moves into other countries, they don't get it? Did we get it from something other than that ideology, or was the fact that we actually developed it ourselves, chose it, and developed our own corporations that benefited the masses more for us, until we developed into a society where our corporations could go out and beat up on the little countries? I mean, where did our high standard of living come from?
One very important point to realize is that a lot of it does come from exploitation of other parts of the world. The United States was a very powerful country. It was one with a very dynamic economy, and that enabled it. Well, it started by subjugating its own continent, first by subjugating the people who used to live in the United States, the Native Americans, and then very quickly spreading to all of Latin America. And what happened is that the United States became powerful very early, and therefore was able to exploit a large part of the rest of the world, just like many of the European powers. Colonialism, or neo-colonialism, which is the form we see today, is about extraction of resources from the countries that are being dominated, and there's not so much difference really. The only difference now is that the United States doesn't have any of the financial responsibilities of a colonial power to maintain a government in those countries that colonize, so it gets the profits without having to pay anything for government. That's a large part of the secret of the well-being of the first world, that the third world is exploited. Another way to say it is that by the nature of the economic structures these countries have, they cannot just be satisfied with remaining internal, with not exploiting other countries. If there's a possibility of exploiting other countries, they will, because that is how the free market works. So that's one point. With countries that have done it and that have gained by exploitation both of the people in those countries and by people elsewhere, have then closed down the opportunities for other countries to follow the same path. That's very important.
The United States has always enjoyed incredible material resources that much of the rest of the world hasn't. A continent with no natural enemies, in a sense, and defense capabilities are quite extraordinary, and natural resources which are really phenomenal in scope. But I think Rahul's other point is that the prosperity of the United States is based to a large degree on the conquest of the rest of the world. If you look at you can do a simple analysis. You look at what parts of the world have developed industrially, and it's basically Europe and the parts of the world that escaped European domination, the United States and Japan. Those are the societies that developed industrially, and they developed, for obvious reasons. They had power and the ability to sort of control their own destiny. What parts of the world didn't develop, right? Latin America, Africa, parts of Asia. Those were societies that were subjugated to those powers. Right? So the obvious analysis, leads you somewhere. Now, the other point I would make about your question, though, is that one has to look at what it means to say the United States is a very prosperous nation, right? Because certain segments of the United States population are prosperous. And it's important to notice and recognize that the economic inequality in this country is radically widening. The difference between the upper 10% of this population and the lower 40% is getting wider. So that, in fact, prosperity at home is something that has to be questioned, too. As the sort of logic of the system unfolds, that inequality, we can assume, is going to deepen. And it's going to cause problems that we are only starting to see. So increasingly, I think what you have in the United States is what you might call an increasingly large internal third world. That is, a population that, from the point of view of economic activity, is largely superfluous. It's not unconnected that we also have the largest prison population in the world, partly because that's a method of social control over that superfluous population, that population that doesn't have a clear role in economic production and consumption. So you've got not only reasons for United States power and dominance and economic vitality that have to do with its subjugation of other parts of the world. It also has to do with the way in which internal dynamics are working, I think. Okay?
That's real interesting because you talk about how prosperous we are now. We've got such a large trade deficit and everything else. I see the system going downhill. There's a lot of indication that it's unraveling. So do you see that also, or not?
Well, it's difficult to say. People have predicted the demise of the international economic system many times before. I would say it's unraveling in the sense that we're moving more and more towards a world with vaster extremes in disparities of wealth, with kinds of exploitation on an order that we've never known before. Whether that means that the system has to collapse, I don't know. A lot of that will depend on whether people start trying to oppose this soon enough to keep us either from falling into barbarism or from coming to the ultimate end of this kind of expansion, which is another kind of barbarism. It depends a lot on us.
It's a sort of truism of political theory that democracy requires a certain amount of equality, which means that as we move to a world in which equality, the gaps in equality are as wide as we're talking about, that meaningful democracy is impossible. And then, I think Rahul points out, the question is, what's the result of that? What kind of resistance to that system will it engender? What kind of chaos and social upheaval will it engender? I think that and in fact I think some of the capitalist class is realizing that with the sort of maniacal pursuit of super profits that have been sort of part of the system since the 80s, in which the U.S. government from the Reagan years on essentially said, you can do what you want, that regulation, even the most nominal regulation, is going to be ignored. That the pursuit of those huge profits has led to a certain kind of instability in the system. And even some of the big thinkers of global capitalism are starting to say, maybe we've gone too far. Maybe we're taking too much and the system can't sustain it. Just like even in political and military affairs, some of the big thinkers of the establishment are starting to say, maybe the U.S. has gone too far. Maybe we're becoming almost a rogue superpower in which the way in which we will wantonly destroy other societies is going to have a backlash, and it's going to be essentially an unstable and unsustainable world system. So even the people who get paid to think about how to make sure that people in power keep their power are starting to say the system may have gone too far, both in economic and in military terms. They're worried. They're worried that this radical inequality is going to produce a world system that just can't be sustained.
And this excess in economic and in military terms is hurting the majority of people in the United States. Look at what's happened to our educational system. Look what's happened to the infrastructure of cities. Look at the fact that we have the largest prison population in the world. All these are symptoms of a society with its priorities for spending and for effort very severely misplaced. A B-2 bomber cost $2.2 billion, and we're talking, and in 1995, we had an end to welfare as we know it. And we're talking about constantly cutting down the amount of money that people who are forced not to be employed by the nature of the system we live in, called structural unemployment. We are forcing them to live on less and less while we're spending huge amounts of money on weapons like this. And wars like the one in Yugoslavia are partly designed also to justify that continued incredible amount of spending. I mean, it's not just the overt military budget, the $280 billion or whatever it is this year. A lot of the money, most of the money we're spending in interest on the national debt is a result of excessive military spending. In fact, if you look at it, and if you take out things like Social Security, there have been times when it's estimated that half or more of the budget of the discretionary spending is essentially defense in one form or another.
And I think it's important to go back to the need for collective action and political organizing. The system sells this as a very natural system, a natural process. It's sort of just almost descended from the heavens. This is the way it will unfold, and there's really no sense in trying to resist it. But capitalism, free market ideology, is no more natural than any other economic system. It is human created, which means it's open to human intervention. And I think it's important to not give in to the logic of the system, which is that it can be no other way. For a while in the late 80s and early 90s, people were talking about the end of history. And the end of history thesis was that liberal capitalist democracies like we live in are sort of the natural fulfillment of history, right? That history is essentially over. The struggle over competing ideologies is over. That's what they've tried to sell us, that capitalism, especially the sort of transnational corporate capitalism of this nature, is in fact inevitable. And it's not inevitable. And that's why political activity, collective action, people getting together first to talk through and understand the system. You were very honest. You said you'd never heard of, for instance, the fact we're still bombing Iraq. Right. Now that's a function of a U.S. press system that's incredibly rigid and constrained. People have to get together, find alternative sources, talk through so they can understand what it is that's at work here. Then from there, the possibility of collective action sort of engages. And from there, the possibility of changing not only who's in power. I mean, I quite frankly don't care if Al Gore or Bill Bradley or George Bush or any of the number of sort of, suits and ties and haircuts who are going to stand up in front of the voters and make campaign commercials wins, because to me that's not the important question. The important question is, can the system be changed? Because it's institutional structural realities that drive it, which is a way of saying that the analysis we all have to do is to ask not who's in power, but to ask where does real power lie? And in any society, real power tends to lie in the people who have control over the resources and the productive capacity of the society. And that's not in Washington, D.C., that's on Wall Street. Okay? Which means that the system has to change, and it's only going to change when people engage in the kind of sort of analysis and collective action that we're talking about.
And apropos of that, Bob and I belong to a group called Peace Action, which is a national group which devotes itself to fighting U.S. foreign policy, in trying to get U.S. military spending reduced, in fighting nuclear weapons and the sending of nuclear waste to places like, for example, the recent fight in West Texas to keep nuclear waste from Vermont from being sent down to Texas, which actually they won. And they also work on issues like the sanctions on Iraq and the war in Yugoslavia. It's a large group. It has 60,000 members nationally. It's a group that has done a lot of good work in trying to oppose both foreign policy of the U.S. and military spending, which are issues that affect all of us. They're having an event. If you want to hear more of this kind of analysis, and especially if you'd like to learn more about the biggest crime that is being committed in the world today, which is the sanctions on Iraq, that event is on August 6th, which is the 9th anniversary of the sanctions. People will be gathering at the state capitol, the South the south part of it, 11th and Congress at 5:15. It'll be from 5:15 to 6:30. So come on by. If you have any questions about the event or about any of the things we said, you can call 471-1990. That's 471-1990.
Peace Action is what you said the name
Uh-huh.
is?
Peace Action.
And there are a lot of groups in the country doing the kind of work that Rahul's talking about. And it's important, again, to get activated. And it's also, I want to remind that August 6th is not only the anniversary of the imposition of the sanctions, but of the dropping of the first atomic weapon on Hiroshima, an act that killed perhaps a couple of 100,000 people. We're talking about sanctions when combined with the Gulf War that have killed well over 1 million, 1.5 million people. The scale of destruction is incredible, and I think it's an event to make those kind of connections.
Okay. We'll try one call real quick here, because we're down to 3.5 minutes here. Mike?
Yes, I
You
got
3
one.
minutes, quickly.
There is one tool that we can use against what's been going on with the government since about 1933. If we could push a bill that would get us out of this presidential decreed state of emergency, it would nullify all the presidential directives, which has allowed our government to just run away. I mean, this is very complex. It's not going. I can't explain all this in 3 minutes.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
But look into it.
Okay, please call back next week then.
All right.
Okay, and that gives me a chance to promote next week. If anybody saw the show Wednesday, it was called Signs of God, Science Test Faith. We taped it. We're going to be discussing that next week. So please. Oh, I thought I heard something.
Do we know who our guest is going to be?
I'm
not going to be here.
Yeah, Jeff D won't be
I'm
here.
going to be out
next
of
week.
town.
Yeah.
Oh, that stinks.
Well.
Oh, well.
Hey, we'll have fun with that. But I do want to thank Bob and Rahul for coming out today. And it's been very educational. Definitely learned a lot more about foreign policy. And like I said, you folks need to get out there and educate yourself on what exactly is going on in foreign policy so you can get and do an educated vote. I assume both of you gentlemen vote.
I vote, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Is there a website for this organization?
There's a national peace action website at www.peace-action.org. We don't have a local one yet, but the national website will give you information about the national group, and if you call 471-1990, we can give you information about the local group.
Okay, great.
I think the American way it needs a lot of improvement, but that's what's so great about it is we have the options to change within. We don't have to go out there and start all over from scratch. We can go out and try to change it within and be educated. But the last election here in Austin, when there's like 8% of the turnout, and when you have 8% out there voting, they can do just about anything they want and know they can get away with it.
Well, the important thing is to start participating in the making of public policy, and sometimes that means resisting the government, and that's what we do.
Excellent. Like I said, we're heading to Furs, North Cross Mall. The restaurant opens at 11 o'clock. Give everybody a chance to get through the line, and then we'll probably start about 11:30. Get everybody a chance there. And
His bald head.
Yeah,
He's
I did
back.
shave this morning. They did the close-up so they can show it. I'm glad to be back, honestly. And I don't have to be the star here. Got any music to go out with there, Arlo? Like the Burning Book that we started with? That was pretty good.
This is the end of that song. Crank it.
We love you, Austin. See you next week.
Bye, folks.